The flight attendant's voice sliced through the air, brittle and commanding. "I'm going to ask you one last time. Move to the back of the plane or I'll call security." It wasn't just a directive. It was a verdict issued without trial, soaked in disdain, echoing with the kind of judgment that comes from centuries of assumption. Celeste Morgan didn't flinch. She sat tall, her poise not loud but unmistakably powerful. Dressed in a navy blue suit, minimal makeup and hair pinned back in elegant restraint, she looked like someone who knew herself and knew exactly what she deserved. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was calm and smooth, like water over polished stone. "I've already told you I'm not moving." Her words weren't shouted yet. They cracked through the sterile luxury of the first-class cabin. Every polished armrest, every champagne flute, every diamond-encrusted wristwatch in the vicinity seemed to pause. It was the kind of moment that didn't need volume to be heard. But Celeste wasn't new to this kind of theater. She had walked into the plane alone, no grand entrance, no branding on her bag, no elite insignia to announce her. Just a ticket, a name, and a calm confidence that threatened those who equated service with status. Lauren Briggs, the lead flight attendant, was already rattled. She had welcomed the white couple in front of Celeste, with the grace of royalty, bending slightly to compliment Mrs. Thompson's earrings and offering mint tea like it were liquid diamonds. But the moment Celeste appeared, the grace evaporated. The smile dropped, the eyes turned sharp, and the words turned clinical. "Hello, I hope you're not lost." It wasn't a question, it was a dismissal wrapped in protocol. Celeste responded not with resistance but with presence. She nodded silently, acknowledging both the insult and the fact that she wasn't going anywhere. She walked toward her seat in the front row, checking her ticket, not because she was unsure, but because it was a ritual that reaffirmed her right to be there. Lauren, however, moved to intercept like a censor, rejecting an unknown input. "This area is for priority passengers only," she said, arms folded, posture tight with unspoken expectations. Celeste lifted her phone and calmly displayed her boarding pass. "And I am one of those passengers." Lauren didn't look. She didn't need to, because in her mind, people who looked like Celeste never were. Her lips curled into a slight smirk. "Strange. I don't remember seeing your name on the list." Whispers began, heads tilted. Megan Sinclair, all pearls and privilege, peeked over her designer frames. "Probably another auto upgrade situation," she muttered. On the other side of the cabin, Daniel Green, in his tailored grey suit, said nothing but his eyes narrowed. Celeste didn't raise her voice. "Perhaps you should check the list again before jumping to conclusions." Lauren crossed her arms tighter. "I don't need to check. I know exactly who belongs here." It wasn't a statement of procedure. It was a statement of belief. To Lauren, appearances had always told the story: polished shoes, manicured nails, a certain way of holding a wineglass. Celeste had none of that, only the quiet defiance of someone who didn't need to perform to prove herself, but that made her even more threatening. Passengers watched as tension rippled like turbulence before takeoff. A young man muttered, "Why not just move if it's causing a scene?" Another whispered, "First class used to be peaceful." Lauren's voice, sharp and unforgiving, returned, "If you don't move to your seat in economy, I will call security." Celeste's eyes darkened, not with rage but with a silence that said everything. "Call if you feel the need," she replied, as light as a breeze, but laced with a steel that chilled. Lauren hesitated. For a moment she looked directly at Celeste, and what she saw wasn't just a passenger, it was a boundary, one she had just crossed without knowing what stood on the other side. But Lauren never had a habit of looking beyond the surface, and that was her first mistake. Celeste didn't shift an inch. She sat like the eye of a storm, serene, unmoving, and unknowingly the center of gravity now pulling the entire cabin into its orbit. Lauren, however, was pacing that delicate line between command and collapse. The tension in her jaw betrayed her, and though she tried to maintain the poise of authority, it had begun to slip through the cracks of her thinly veiled professionalism. She turned sharply, her heels clicking like warnings on the polished floor. "I will say this one last time," she said louder now. "If you do not comply, I will have no choice but to escalate this." Celeste tilted her head slightly, not in defiance, but in disbelief at the futility of it all. "Do what you need to do," she said again, her voice unchanged, yet it held the weight of a verdict. A murmur rippled through the cabin. This wasn't just another disagreement. This was a line being drawn. At the rear of the aisle, Grace Holloway, the assistant flight attendant, barely into her 20s, stood gripping the passenger manifest like a lifeline. Her eyes shifted rapidly between the escalating confrontation and the printed names in front of her. Right at the top, bold and underlined, Celeste Morgan, priority confidential status. Her lips parted, almost speaking, but Lauren turned her eyes, flashing an unspoken command that pinned Grace in place. The same silent warning young women in uniforms had learned to obey: don't interrupt the chain of command, no matter how wrong it is. Celeste's gaze softened on Grace for just a moment, just long enough for Grace to feel seen, to feel that her silence mattered. Then Celeste turned back to Lauren and adjusted the cuff of her blazer with the grace of someone still in control of her own space, even if no one else was recognizing it. "She's causing trouble," Lauren barked, now unraveling, sneaking into first class and acting like she owns the plane. The irony hung so thick it could have been cut with a butter knife. From his seat, Daniel Green finally closed his laptop. He leaned forward, his voice smooth but firm, echoing like a quiet gavel through the tense silence. "Ma'am, I think you should check the list before you humiliate someone in front of the entire cabin." Lauren's eyes widened as if she'd been slapped. "Don't you see where she's from?" She said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Celeste raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. That silence, pure, sharp and deliberate, settled like frost on every surface around them. And for the first time, Lauren felt the ground beneath her confidence begin to crack. Grace was still frozen, her hands trembling slightly. The passenger list quivering in her grasp. Celeste's eyes met hers again. She didn't say a word, but Grace felt something pass between them, an invitation, a question, a mirror. "Do you really want to be complicit in this?" Lauren's voice, now brittle, pushed on. "I am responsible for maintaining order in this cabin. I know who is allowed here." Daniel stood up slowly, the weight of his experience lending gravity to his stance. "Then why haven't you opened the list?" Lauren didn't answer. Celeste leaned back slightly in her seat and asked in the most precise, devastating tone, "I am in the right place, Miss Briggs." "And you? Where are you?" The question wasn't loud, but it struck like thunder. The cabin fell into a hush so complete, even the hum of the engines seemed to fade. No one moved, no one breathed. Lauren's cheeks flushed as if the very question had peeled away every layer of manufactured decorum she wore like armor. She didn't answer, not because she couldn't, but because she had no ground left to stand on. Still, she didn't retreat. Pride rarely surrenders without a fight. She spun on her heel, pressing the call button for cabin service, muttering sharply, "Start pre-takeoff prep." Her voice cracked slightly. No one missed it. She returned minutes later with a tray of chilled champagne and a smile that looked more like a bandage, hastily slapped over a gaping wound. Mr. Thompson got the first glass. Mrs. Thompson followed, then Daniel Green, then Megan Sinclair, who whispered sarcastically, "What a show." Lauren gave a forced laugh, but when she reached Celeste's row, she didn't stop. Not to serve, not to look, not even to acknowledge. Celeste didn't press the call button. She didn't wave, but when the tray was nearly empty, she spoke not loudly but clearly. "Excuse me, could I have a glass of water, please?" Lauren stopped mid-step. She turned, eyes narrowing. Her voice came out like frost clinging to glass. "I'll be back after I'm done." She walked away, leaving behind only the chill of withheld dignity. And Celeste sat there, watching her go, not with rage, not with sorrow, but with the quiet stillness of a storm that had just begun to form. 5 minutes later, Lauren returned, now wielding a fresh tray, this time with bottled waters. She moved through the rows like nothing had happened, passing bottles with mechanical precision. But when she approached Celeste's seat, something shifted. Celeste's right leg was stretched out slightly, resting just inside the edge of the aisle, a relaxed, natural posture given the cramped first-class configuration. Lauren saw it, and then she made a choice. She veered abruptly, slamming her knee into Celeste's outstretched leg. Hard, deliberate, unmistakable. The tray in her hand jolted 3 glasses, tumbled water, splashing in chaotic arcs across Celeste's tailored pants and onto the pristine carpet. The sound of glass striking the floor echoed louder than it should have. Lauren shrieked, pulling back as if she were the one attacked. "You put your foot in the way." Look what you've done." Head snapped toward the commotion. Mrs. Thompson gasped, dropping her knitting. Megan clicked her tongue. Daniel Green clenched his fists, but the one person who didn't react in outrage was the one who had been soaked. Celeste calmly reached down, brushing the cold droplets from her lap. Her motions were slow, composed, measured. She looked up, eyes locked on Lauren, her voice just above a whisper, but carrying more weight than any shout. "You did that on purpose." Lauren froze. "What did you say? You did that on purpose?" Celeste repeated her tone, cutting clean through the air. "And all I ask is to be treated with the same respect as everyone else on this flight." Silence fell. Grace Holloway stood at the edge of the cabin, mouth slightly open, eyes wide. She had seen everything: Lauren's turn, the collision, the spill, the performance. And now, for the first time, she knew this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was an attack, subtle, calculated, and cruel. The atmosphere shifted. The cold wetness on Celeste's suit no longer mattered. It was the cold rising in everyone's chest that made the moment unforgettable. A young woman at the rear whispered, "She's right." That wasn't an accident. Someone else muttered, "She didn't even apologize." Lauren stood frozen in place. The tray in her hands trembled slightly. For a woman so obsessed with control, she was unraveling one mistake at a time. "Who do you think you are?" she hissed under her breath. "Talking to me like that?" Celeste didn't blink. She lifted a napkin and gently wiped her wrist, then met Lauren's eyes, someone who's tired of being spoken down to. Her words struck deeper than volume ever could. There was no plea in them, no victimhood, only truth. A truth that demanded no justification. The tension in Lauren's body twisted into something bitter and volatile. She took 2 steps forward. Her voice dropped low, sharp enough to draw blood. "Don't think you can sit here and act like a queen just because you got lucky with a first-class ticket." That attitude, she didn't finish. Instead, she raised her hand and slapped Celeste across the face. The sound cracked through the cabin like a gunshot. It wasn't rage, it wasn't drama, it was silence. Real silence. The kind that stretches through time like a blade. Grace gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Megan Sinclair stiffened in her seat, her eyes wide with horror. Mr. Thompson froze mid-page of his newspaper. No one spoke. No one moved. And Celeste, she didn't flinch. She didn't raise a hand. She didn't cry out. She sat still, unmoving, as though the slap had missed entirely. Her cheek bore the clear outline of Lauren's hand, red and raw, but her composure was untouched. Slowly, she turned her face back to Lauren. Her eyes weren't filled with anger. They were filled with something more dangerous: clarity. "You've just made the biggest mistake of your life," she said softly, with the calm of someone handing down a sentence. Lauren's confidence cracked in that moment, because everyone around them now knew this wasn't a difficult passenger. This was something else. Someone else. Before anyone could process it, Daniel Green stood up, his voice low but commanding, like a courtroom closing in. "Miss Briggs, you've just assaulted a passenger in front of at least 10 witnesses. Do you understand the legal consequences of your actions?" Lauren turned to him, her lips parted in panic. I didn't mean," she provoked. But the words didn't matter anymore. Celeste slowly rose to her feet, dabbing her cheek with a napkin. She didn't yell, she didn't storm, she didn't demand. Her silence was louder than any declaration. Every person in the cabin could feel the energy shifting, not toward rage, but toward reckoning. Across the aisle, Mrs. Thompson whispered, "She doesn't look like a regular passenger." Her husband replied, "No. She's something bigger." And in that moment, Lauren Briggs finally realized she wasn't the one running the cabin anymore. The cabin was frozen in a collective gasp. Lauren Briggs stood still, her hand lingering in the air as if she hadn't fully processed what she'd just done. Her breath caught in her throat, her eyes wide and panicked, not because she felt regret, but because she suddenly understood she had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Celeste Morgan remained standing, the red imprint on her cheek stark against her rich brown skin. But she made no move to retreat, no motion to retaliate. She adjusted her collar, brushed a stray hair from her face, and looked at Lauren with a gaze so steady, so devastatingly calm, it stripped away every shred of illusion Lauren had built around her authority. From behind, Grace Holloway took a cautious step forward. Her voice trembled, but her courage held firm. "Miss Morgan, I'll get you a cold towel and call medical assistance. Lauren snapped toward her. Grace, but this time Grace didn't cower. She looked directly at Celeste, her chin lifted slightly. Celeste offered a soft smile, small, controlled, but enough to signal that the storm she had endured was no longer hers to carry alone. It's fine, Celeste said gently. I appreciate your kindness. Daniel Green had already pulled out his phone, recording steadily, his expression unreadable but resolute. The moment had shifted. Lauren could feel it. The air felt heavier, but she herself felt smaller. Eyes were on her now, not with respect, but with judgment. Then came the footsteps, heavy, decisive. From the cockpit emerged Captain Ross Wellington. His eyes scanned the tense scene, then landed on Celeste. Lauren turned toward him with a desperate, rehearsed tone. Captain, I've got the situation under control. Just a disruptive passenger, nothing more. Silence, Briggs. Captain Ross said, his voice like steel cracking glass. He walked calmly into the aisle, stopping between the rows, his presence bringing a grave finality to the moment. He turned slowly to Lauren, but not with the curiosity of a man trying to understand a problem. No, he was here to deliver consequences. We've received direct orders from executive management, he said, each word loud enough for everyone to hear. The owner of flight WS472 is currently on board. Gasps, shock. A wave of stunned realization rippled through the cabin like aftershocks of an earthquake. Lauren's lips parted. What Captain Ross looked directly at Celeste and nodded, his tone shifting into the formal reverence reserved for dignitaries. Miss Celeste Morgan, I deeply apologize for what has happened. I am enacting emergency protocol per direction from the CEO's office. Megan Sinclair's hand covered her mouth, her eyes wide, as if she had just witnessed the ending of a thriller she didn't know she was living in. Daniel Green gave a nod, murmuring, I knew it. Lauren, now white as the napkin in her hand, staggered back half a step. I didn't know she never said. No one needed to tell you, Captain Ross said, his voice hardening, because our policy is crystal clear. Every passenger is to be treated with equal respect, regardless of rank, regardless of color, regardless of appearance. Celeste remained still. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. But Lauren did. She had to. I didn't mean to. She was just her tone. Captain Ross cut her off. You are the one who violated the rules. From your unwelcoming remarks to your refusal to check the passenger list, your physical assault, and your obstruction of a fellow crew member. And now everything you've said and done has been recorded. All eyes were on Lauren, and she finally understood she wasn't a flight attendant anymore. She was the center of a trial. Celeste finally stepped forward. She stood in front of Lauren, not towering, not gloating, just present. A storm reduced to its most dangerous form, silence made solid. She spoke quietly but clearly, each word like a blade carved in marble. You never cared who I was. You cared that I didn't look the way you expected. And that gave you permission in your mind to treat me as less. Lauren opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Celeste turned to Captain Ross. I request that this crew member be removed from service immediately. Noted, he replied. With a swift motion, Captain Ross pulled the ID badge from Lauren's uniform. The sharp snap of the lanyard tearing free was louder than it should have been. To Lauren, it might as well have been the sound of 1,000 doors slamming shut. Her knees buckled slightly. She dropped into the nearest seat, face pale, eyes blank. Captain Ross turned to the cabin, his voice now steady, formal. A replacement crew is en route. Please remain seated while we coordinate with airport authorities. And then Celeste turned to Grace, her voice loud enough for all to hear. Grace Holloway, you upheld professional ethics when everything around you was falling apart. Today you showed courage. Grace blinked, tears welling in her eyes. You will receive an appointment letter from my office, Celeste continued, effective immediately. The cabin was dead silent, but the kind of silence that held reverence. No one clapped, no one spoke. But respect, once denied, now bloomed in every gaze fixed on Celeste Morgan. Celeste didn't rush to leave the cabin. She could have. After all, the door was open, the black SUV from Right Skies Airlines was waiting on the tarmac, and her assistants stood ready at the private staircase. But she didn't move. Not yet. Instead, she turned slowly to face the passengers, those who had watched, those who had whispered, those who had stayed silent. Her presence, once dismissed, now carried the undeniable gravity of someone who had reclaimed her space. She stepped forward, her heels clicking softly against the aisle floor. "I'd like to say a few words," she said, not loudly, but clearly enough for every seat to hear. No one interrupted, no one even blinked. "I sincerely apologize for what has happened," Celeste said. "What you witnessed today is not the standard of service that Right Skies stands for. Not in the skies, not on the ground." Her voice held no self-praise, no theatrical flourish, only clarity. "We do not serve passengers based on wealth, wardrobe, or the color of their skin. We serve people." Across the rows, heads slowly began to nod. A few eyes lowered in quiet shame. Others stared straight ahead, absorbing every syllable like a verdict passed on themselves. Celeste turned to Grace, who still stood rooted to the floor, her notebook clutched in both hands like a shield. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes glassy. She looked like someone standing at the edge of a transformation she never expected to be part of. "Grace Holloway," Celeste said, her tone suddenly soft but no less strong. "You stood for the truth when others hesitated. You honored this airline, and you honored yourself." Grace blinked back tears. "Thank you, Miss Morgan. I only did what I thought was right." And that, Celeste replied, is exactly what we need more of. She placed a hand gently on Grace's shoulder, not from a place of authority, but as a gesture of trust. It wasn't the pat of a superior rewarding a subordinate, it was the silent transfer of belief from one woman to another in full view of everyone who had pretended not to see. A soft ripple of applause began. One pair of hands, then another. Then the entire cabin joined in, not in polite routine, but in quiet conviction. Daniel Green, seated closest to the aisle, stood and offered a nod that carried the weight of everything unspoken. "You've reminded us all that respect is not a favor. It's a foundation." Celeste nodded in return, but her eyes never wavered from the deeper truth written across each face. "Before we resume our flight," she continued, "I want to make something clear. What happened today will not be buried in protocol. It will be the catalyst for change, for every crew member, for every airport, for every passenger who was ever told in so many subtle ways that they were less." She paused, then turned toward the rows behind her. "And if anyone here still thinks that respect should be earned based on appearance, I invite you to think again." Megan Sinclair looked away. Her shoulders, once squared in elegant judgment, now slouched ever so slightly under the weight of reflection. Mrs. Thompson dabbed her eyes with a tissue. Mr. Thompson gave a small nod of approval. Outside, the sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, casting warm orange light through the oval windows. A moment that should have been just another leg of a routine journey had become something far more permanent, etched not in schedules or sky miles, but in the collective conscience of everyone aboard. Then from the cockpit, the announcement chimed in. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Ross. We will be resuming our flight shortly. Please remain seated while final checks are conducted. We thank you for your patience and your understanding." Celeste turned to leave finally, but just as she reached the cabin door, a trembling voice called out, "Wait." Everyone turned. It was Lauren. Still seated near the front, her posture crumpled, her voice hoarse, her face streaked with silent tears. "I didn't know who you were," she whispered. "Please, I need this job. I didn't mean to." Celeste turned slowly. Her expression was unreadable, not cruel, not soft. "Just true." "No," she said, "you didn't intend to get caught." Lauren flinched. "But you showed who you are when you thought no one was watching." Two TSA officers had just stepped through the open aircraft door, their badges gleaming in the fading light. Miss Morgan, the taller one, said, "We've been informed of an assault on board. Would you like to press formal charges?" Celeste didn't look at Lauren when she answered. "Yes, I will file an official complaint for public assault witnessed by multiple passengers on flight WS472. She turned to the officers and added, "Not because I'm the CEO, not because I own this airline, but because I am a single mother and a human being. And I was humiliated, slapped, and treated like I didn't belong here." Lauren's shoulders sagged. The fight was gone. Only the hollow echo of her own mistakes remained. The handcuffs clicked, and with that sound, the hierarchy of injustice she had clung to so tightly shattered at last. As the officers gently took Lauren Briggs by the arms, guiding her toward the cabin door, the metallic snap of the handcuffs still echoed like a final punctuation mark in the minds of every passenger. Her once perfectly styled hair had loosened her uniform, no longer carried its sharp presence. It hung on her like a memory she couldn't outrun. No one said a word, not out of cruelty, but out of solemn recognition. They had all seen it. They had all been part of it. And now the fall was unfolding before their eyes, not with violence, not with spectacle, but with the slow, deliberate unraveling of a person who had built her identity on authority rather than empathy. Lauren looked back over her shoulder just once, not at Celeste, not at the officers, but at the place where she had stood, where she used to command, used to dismiss, used to decide who belonged and who didn't. She tried to speak, her lips parted, trembling. "Please, I need this job. I didn't know who you were." But the cabin didn't respond with sympathy. They didn't need to, because the lesson had already landed. Celeste stood firm near the front, her eyes following Lauren, not with vengeance, but with resolution. Her final words to the disgraced flight attendant weren't loud. They didn't need to be. "I don't need you to know who I am," she said softly. "I need you to know, to respect everyone, no matter who they are." The words didn't land like a speech. They landed like a legacy. Behind her, someone began to clap, just once, then another. Then a ripple moved through the rows, not forced, not theatrical, but steady and real. Applause for a woman who had refused to shrink, who hadn't yelled, who hadn't begged, who had simply stood tall. The kind of applause that doesn't come from entertainment, but from awakening. Grace stood nearby, her hands clasped to her chest, eyes red not from sadness, but from something closer to awe. She turned to look at Lauren one last time. Her gaze had changed. It wasn't fear, it wasn't revenge, it was clarity, because Grace had seen the moment the truth revealed itself, not in the slap, not in the chaos, but in the stillness that followed. The officers led Lauren away, their footsteps echoing evenly as they crossed the threshold into the waiting SUV. The cabin door closed behind them with a whisper, but that quiet sound felt like a vault being sealed. Celeste remained where she was for another moment, letting the silence settle like dust after a storm. Then she turned and faced the passengers once more. Her voice was softer now, but just as steady. "We'll be departing shortly. Thank you for your patience and for your presence." She paused, then glanced back at Grace. "If anyone needs water or comfort while we wait, Grace and the support crew will be happy to assist." Grace nodded with a renewed sense of purpose. The new crew had arrived, faces, fresh eyes, steady, uniforms crisp but not cold. One of them, Julia Chen, the new head flight attendant, walked toward Celeste and bowed slightly. "We're honored to serve you today, Miss Morgan," she said, "and thank you for changing what it means to serve." Celeste gave a faint smile. "I'm honored to fly with all of you." She took her seat again, her posture now relaxed, but her presence still undeniable. She didn't have to say anything more. The message had already been written in the memory of everyone on board. From the windows, the last light of day stretched across the runway. Engines began to hum softly as the aircraft prepared for takeoff. But in the hearts of those on board, something else had already lifted. Not just the weight of tension, but the realization that someone had stood up, not for revenge, not for spectacle, but for dignity. And because of that, nothing on this flight would ever feel the same again. 12 minutes later, the aircraft lifted off from the private runway, its silver wings catching the final blush of sunset. As the wheels tucked away beneath the fuselage, the cabin of Flight WS-472 was no longer just a luxury space, filled with fine leather seats and polished trays. It had become something deeper. A witness, a courtroom, a sanctuary, and now a vessel of change. Celeste sat quietly in her seat, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of her notebook. She wasn't scrolling through a phone. She wasn't drafting an email. She was simply still like a stone after a storm, grounded and unmoved. Across the aisle, Daniel Green leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, still absorbing what had happened. He glanced at Grace, who was now assisting a new passenger with calm confidence. There was no more hesitation in her, no more fear in her steps. She had found something stronger than rules, her own moral compass. Meanwhile, the rest of the passengers began to whisper again. But these weren't the murmurs of suspicion or judgment, they were reflections. "I think she saved this flight," someone muttered. Honestly, I've never seen anything like that. She's not just a CEO, she's something else. And it was true. Celeste hadn't tried to prove her power, she had revealed it quietly, unmistakably. Not with titles, but with truth. Not with force, but with grace. 30,000 feet above the ground, a new kind of order had taken root. Back in the galley, Julia Chen, now leading the cabin crew, gathered her team. She looked each of them in the eye and said, "This is not just about protocol anymore. From now on, it's about principle. Let's make sure everyone on this flight is seen." And they did. A young mother with an infant was offered a soft blanket and an extra bottle of warm milk. A nervous elderly man traveling alone was given a gentle arm to lean on while adjusting his seat. Even the most stoic business travelers softened, cracking polite smiles and nodding in silent gratitude as service passed down the aisle, not like entitlement, but like respect flowing freely. Near the back, a teenage girl of South Asian descent wrote in her journal, her pen dancing quickly across the paper. When asked by her seatmate what she was writing, she whispered, "History." At the front of the cabin, Celeste finally flipped open her notebook. Inside wasn't a speech or a plan. It was a letter, a handwritten note folded neatly, ink slightly smudged. It read, "Thank you for not waiting. Thank you for speaking up when so many of us couldn't. I've flown this airline before. I've been ignored, overlooked, doubted. You didn't just fight for yourself, you fought for us." A silent passenger. Celeste folded the letter again and placed it in the inside pocket of her blazer. Not for keepsake. For reminder. A voice came over the speaker. "This is your captain. Estimated arrival to New York is on time. Weather is clear. We thank you for choosing Right Skies Airlines." But inside that cabin, passengers weren't just flying toward a destination. They were flying through transformation. A few rows down, Grace approached Celeste with a soft voice. "Miss Morgan, can I bring you anything else?" Celeste looked up at her, not with hierarchy, not with formality, but with warmth. "You've already brought me something," she said. "Hope." Grace smiled through tears she hadn't realized were forming. Celeste leaned back into her seat, eyes drifting toward the window. The sun had dipped below the clouds, now casting a golden halo along the plane's edge. She rested her head gently against the glass, and she breathed. Not the breath of someone escaping disaster, but the breath of someone who had spoken, who had stood, and who had endured without bending. She knew this wasn't the end. This was only the ripple. The impact would stretch beyond this cabin, beyond this airline, beyond this moment. But for now, she allowed herself one thing she had denied herself too often in the past: peace. Outside, the sky opened wide. Inside the cabin carried the quiet hum of reflection, not just from altitude, but from elevation of spirit. Flight WS-4472 had taken off not just toward a city, but toward something greater, and everyone on board knew it. 2 days later, the ripple from that flight had become a wave. At Right Skies Airlines headquarters in Chicago, a towering structure of glass and steel overlooking the lake, a buzz unlike any crisis response or PR stunt permeated every hallway. But it wasn't chaos, it was purpose. Purpose with urgency. Purpose with clarity. Purpose with Celeste Morgan at its helm. Inside the executive boardroom, the senior leadership team gathered not around a polished table for a traditional meeting, but in rows of chairs, auditorium style. There was no coffee service, no slide decks, no pleasantries. Celeste stood in the center, not on a raised platform, not behind a podium. Just her still in navy sleeves, rolled once holding a remote in one hand, and a conviction that now filled the entire room. Behind her, a giant screen bore 6 bold words: "Rebuild with respect. Start today." She began not with anger nor apology. "I don't care how much this costs," she said. "I care who we become after this." No one breathed. Celeste paced slowly across the floor. What happened on WS-472 is not just a story, it's a warning. It didn't begin with a slap. It began with a smile, withheld a name unacknowledged, a seat questioned. That's how prejudice starts. With the little permissions we give ourselves to see someone as less. She stopped looking directly into the eyes of the head of HR, the VP of training, the COO, the internal audit chief. And if that can happen to me, the CEO of this company, then what's happening to the thousands of others who don't have a title to shield them? Silence. only heads lowering slightly, shoulders tightening and then slowly rising in understanding. Celeste raised the remote and the screen changed. A three-phase transformation plan appeared. 1. Comprehensive retraining. Every staff member from pilots to gate agents to call center reps would undergo an 8-week immersive training in unconscious bias, ethical service, and dignity-centered communication. No more quick online modules. No more box checking. 2. Dignity Line Platform. An always-on real-time anonymous reporting system tied directly to the CEO's office, bypassing mid-level suppression. Any complaint of discrimination, demeaning treatment, or abuse of power would be logged, tracked, and addressed visibly. 3. New accountability framework. Discrimination of any kind, race, gender, age, appearance, would no longer go through lengthy HR mediation. If confirmed, it would result in immediate suspension and termination, with a lifetime ban from re-employment at Right Skies. There was no applause. There was only stunned agreement. One executive finally spoke, and the industry, what if we lose people, good people? Celeste met his eyes without flinching. If they leave because they can't treat others with respect, they were never good people. The screen behind her faded to black. She clicked once more. A final phrase appeared. No one is born to discriminate, but everyone must choose whether or not to stay blind to it. That line, already posted on Right Sky's internal site, had been viewed 18,000 times in the past 24 hours. It had also begun trending online. Across social media, the viral video clip of Celeste calmly stating, "Respect is not a reward. It's a right," had amassed over 12 million views. Major news networks had picked up the story, praising not just her reaction on the flight, but her refusal to handle it in silence. A high school teacher in Ohio had printed her quote on the classroom wall. A Fortune 500 CEO had reposted the clip with the caption, "Finally, leadership with a backbone." A passenger who had witnessed the incident from seat 3D had published an op-ed titled, "I watched a woman rewrite airline history without raising her voice." But for Celeste, none of it was about image. It was about infrastructure and impact. Later that day, she sat quietly at her desk, her assistant placing a stack of letters in front of her, handwritten most from passengers, staff, and people she'd never met. One stood out. The handwriting was jagged, hesitant. "I work as a cleaner at the airport. I've always been invisible. But after what you did, my manager asked my name for the first time in 2 years." "Thank you." Celeste didn't cry. But she did close her eyes, letting the words wash over her like a quiet wave of affirmation. She hadn't set out to be a symbol. She had only wanted to stand. And now the company she built was finally standing with her. Outside, the sun dipped lower against the Chicago skyline, and somewhere miles above, another flight soared forward lighter than ever before. That Friday morning flight, WS639 from Chicago to Boston, prepared for takeoff at Gate 7 of the private terminal. No press, no ceremony, no headline fanfare. Just a flight like any other. Except it wasn't. Because this was the first Right Skies flight to operate under the new Dignity First protocol. And everyone on board knew it. Julia Chen stood at the entrance of the aircraft, her uniform crisp but approachable, a small pin on her lapel bearing a single engraved word, "Equal." She had spent 15 years working for 3 international airlines, had served thousands of passengers from every background, and had considered quitting more than once, especially after witnessing years of subtle dismissals, invisible biases, and unspoken power dynamics. But she hadn't. And today she was glad she hadn't. When Celeste Morgan stepped onto the aircraft, dressed in her usual navy, with her hair pulled back neatly, Julia didn't hesitate. She extended her hand with warmth, not performance. "We're honored to serve you, Miss Morgan," she said. "And on behalf of the crew, thank you for changing how we're seen." Celeste returned the handshake and gave a small nod. "I'm honored to fly with you. No press photos, no special seat arrangements, no welcome ma'am," muttered through gritted teeth. Just a quiet acknowledgement between 2 professionals who had both endured the invisible weight of being underestimated and had chosen to stay. As Celeste walked down the aisle toward her seat, she passed passengers who now looked at her with recognition, not just of her face, but of her integrity. A middle-aged woman reading a novel looked up. "Excuse me," she said gently. "Are you Celeste Morgan?" Celeste paused, her smile soft. "Yes." The woman beamed. I'm a professor. My students just wrote essays about you this week. Celeste chuckled. I hope they were kind. They were more than kind, the professor said. They called you the quiet fire, said you didn't raise your voice, you raised the bar. Celeste nodded, her eyes slightly moist. Thank you for telling me that. She took her seat by the window. Outside, the tarmac shimmered beneath the morning sun, but inside the cabin, something else shimmered awareness. Julia moved through the cabin with her team. The old rituals of service remained: drink offers, safety checks, but they were layered now with something different, something unspoken, something that had been missing for far too long. True presence. Midway through the flight, a boy around 8 years old in seat 4A, skin the color of caramel, leaned into the aisle and asked Miss Julia, "Can I have more orange juice?" Julia bent down with a smile that didn't feel forced. "Of course, little captain. Do you want ice with that?" The boy giggled. His mother looked up, caught Celeste's gaze from across the aisle, and nodded a small gesture between strangers, bound by something deeper than coincidence. Celeste smiled back. As the plane soared above Cleveland, the sunlight streamed across the carpet and up onto Celeste's lap, illuminating the notebook resting on her tray. She flipped it open, not to any work document or company memo, but to a passage she had written years ago when she was still building the airline from scratch. The true value of leadership isn't in rank or reach. It's where you stand when the winds change. She had written that line after being turned away from a luxury lounge in London for wearing sneakers. Back then, she had said nothing. Today, her silence had been transformed into a movement. From the galley, Julia brought a glass of water and set it gently beside Celeste. "You may not know this," she said quietly, "but what you did helped me stay. I was about to leave aviation for good. I thought people like us didn't belong in first class on either side of the aisle." Celeste looked up, eyes steady. "Then we have to keep standing, because there are too many who still believe they're alone." Julia nodded, her eyes shining beneath the cabin lights. Outside, the clouds rolled slowly beneath them, soft, white, and open. Inside, the aircraft hummed with an energy not written in the flight manual. A new standard had taken off. Not one based on how people look, or what they wear, or how much they earn, but on how deeply we choose to respect them when we think no one will hold us accountable. And this time, someone had. Celeste leaned her head against the window, her eyes tracing the horizon. She didn't need headlines. She didn't need apologies. She just needed this, a cabin where people no longer had to fight to be seen. And for the first time in a long time, she could breathe deeply because the skies finally felt right. By the following week, the aviation industry had begun to shift, not out of corporate fear, but out of collective self-reflection. What had happened on Flight WS472 wasn't just a one-off anomaly. It had become a case study, a mirror. Celeste Morgan's name now carried weight in places where ethics had long been treated as window dressing: private boardrooms, internal policy memos, recruitment panels. Not because she demanded it, but because her silence in the face of humiliation and her strength in the face of that silence had awakened something long dormant. Major competitors like Polaris Jet and Titan Air released public statements committing to new internal audits of their service policies. West Coast Wings quietly reached out to hire the consultancy team Celeste had referenced during her post-flight reform plan. And two smaller airlines, once considered rivals, openly requested access to her Dignity First training blueprint. Celeste granted it without charge. "This is not about competition," she told them, "it's about course correction." At a conference on corporate ethics at Stanford University, she was invited to speak not as a businesswoman, but as a case study in moral clarity. She didn't dress up for it. No bright power suit, no rehearsed anecdotes, just her in black slacks, a soft white shirt, and a story that had already changed thousands of hearts. She stood center stage, hands at her sides, and began. "When I was slapped on that plane, it wasn't just a hand that touched my face. It was every moment I'd been told to sit down, stay quiet, blend in, or be grateful for crumbs." The room went still, and I knew that if I didn't speak not as a CEO, but as a human being, then that slap would echo in cabins all over the world where people without titles would suffer in silence. She paused, looked around the room. That day wasn't a disruption, it was an unveiling. The applause wasn't loud, it was slow, steady, the kind that says, "We didn't just hear you, we felt you." Outside of boardrooms in places Celeste might never walk, her story had become a signal. In classrooms, her quote, "Respect is not a reward, it's a right," was printed in block letters above chalkboards. A non-profit working with marginalized women requested permission to use her story in their empowerment curriculum. And at airports across the country, something subtle began to change. Flight attendants, who had once been told to smile more, now stood straighter not because someone told them to, but because someone had shown them what it meant to serve with dignity. A ground staff worker in Dallas, who had followed Celeste's journey through social media, wrote anonymously, "I used to think no one would ever stand up for people like me. Now I know I don't have to wait for someone else to act." But the most powerful shift didn't come from viral posts or news headlines. It came from within Right Skies. In a quiet conference room on the 16th floor of Company HQ, a new department was formed, the Dignity Office. Not part of HR, not under legal. A separate, fully funded entity whose sole purpose was to uphold and monitor the core principles Celeste had enforced on that flight, not with punishment, but with prevention, education, and visibility. Every new hire would undergo a 1-month onboarding program, not in how to serve, but in how to see. To see bias, to see injustice, to see the quiet moments that could either build trust or erode it. The first internal slogan of the new program was not clever. It was clear: every seat holds a story. Treat it with care. And that was the legacy Celeste wanted, not fanfare, not praise, but a system that remembered what it forgot for too long, that even the sky cannot lift people who are constantly being pushed down. That month, Celeste received hundreds of messages, but one stood out, not from an executive, not from a senator, not from a journalist. It was from the daughter of a flight attendant who had been fired years ago for reporting misconduct. "My mum cried when she read about what you did," it said. "She said you gave her story a second ending. Thank you for not letting silence win." Celeste closed the message and leaned back in her chair. Outside her office window, another plane took off its silver belly, catching the light of the midday sun. And somewhere on that flight, someone, perhaps a passenger, perhaps a crew member, was sitting a little taller. Because they knew that even if no one else saw them, someone had made sure their worth couldn't be ignored anymore. Celeste smiled not for herself, but for them, and for the sky that was finally wide enough for everyone. Weeks passed, but the story didn't fade. Instead, it spread not just across the aviation industry, but across professions, households, and digital spaces where people who had long felt invisible now found their voices echoed in Celeste Morgan's quiet defiance. The world hadn't needed another headline. It had needed a reckoning. And somehow, from Seat 1A, a movement had taken flight. On a rainy Thursday morning in Atlanta, a father and daughter boarded a flight to attend a college tour. The daughter, 15, held tight to her notebook. Inside it was a handwritten copy of Celeste's quote, "If you only protect justice when it's easy, then it's no longer justice." In Los Angeles, a luxury hotel quietly replaced its old guest policy after an internal memo from one of their regional directors simply read, "Let's make sure no guest ever has a WS-472 moment under our roof." And in a brightly lit newsroom in New York, a veteran journalist pitched a feature titled, "The Woman Who Sat Still and Shifted a System." But Celeste wasn't chasing recognition. She was rebuilding her company, this time from the inside out. Inside the Right Skies employee training hub, large panels now adorned the walls. Not slogans, not stock images, but portraits, real ones. One wall held Grace Holloway's face mid-laugh, captured on a layover tarmac with wind in her hair and fire in her eyes. Below it, a quote from Celeste: "She spoke when it mattered most." That's leadership. On the opposite wall hung a portrait of Celeste, not in her CEO office, not on a stage, but on the cabin floor of flight WS-472, seated serene, surrounded by passengers in frozen attention. It was taken just seconds after she declared, "You've made the biggest mistake of your life." And under that photo, etched into a strip of steel, power is not in titles. Power is in truth. One of the most surprising changes happened quietly in HR. Following Lauren Briggs' arrest and the revelations from her past co-workers about a pattern of discriminatory behavior, the airline launched an anonymous review system for internal culture and treatment. Staff could now grade not just managers, but one another, including feedback on moments of allyship, decency, and standing up. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and real Celeste knew was the only place change could breathe. In a small town in Mississippi, an African-American middle school teacher used Celeste's story as the opening unit for her ethics curriculum. She printed out photos, transcribed quotes, and asked her students, "What would you have done if you were there?" One boy answered softly, "I would have stood up, even if I was scared." The teacher smiled. "Then you already understand the lesson." And Lauren, her trial was set for the following month. Though she had hired legal counsel and issued a public statement of remorse, the evidence, including multiple passenger recordings, witness testimonies, and the airline's own internal findings, left little ambiguity. But the legal proceedings were no longer the center of the story. Because Lauren Briggs wasn't just a symbol of misconduct, she was a symptom of a culture that rewards control over compassion, of a mindset that mistakes politeness for professionalism while allowing cruelty to bloom beneath the surface. And that was what Celeste had severed. In her final public interview of the year, broadcast nationally on a quiet Sunday evening, the host asked her, "Miss Morgan, what would you say to those who still think you overreacted?" Celeste didn't blink. Her voice was quiet but resolute. "I didn't react at all," she said. "I responded. There's a difference. Reactions come from fear. Responses come from clarity. And if speaking up clearly makes someone uncomfortable, then that discomfort is where they need to start their own journey." The host sat still for a moment, then nodded. "And what about forgiveness?" Celeste folded her hands in her lap. "Forgiveness isn't forgetting, it's choosing not to carry their weight with you. But accountability, that still stands." That interview, like everything else, went viral. Not because it shocked, but because it resonated. Celeste hadn't delivered revenge. She had delivered reckoning with grace. And from that, something sacred had been rebuilt. Not an airline, but the standard by which human dignity would be measured, seat by seat, silence by silence, truth by truth. Above the clouds, right skies flights kept taking off. But this time, every takeoff carried something extra weightless, invisible, but powerful beyond measure. A promise that no matter who you are, what you look like, or where you sit, you deserve to be seen. 3 weeks later, in a courtroom nestled between glass towers in downtown Chicago, the trial of Lauren Briggs began, not with cameras flashing or crowds protesting, but with something quieter and more powerful attention from those who had once been overlooked. In the gallery sat flight attendants from across the country, many still in uniform. Next to them were passengers from flight WS472 who had flown in on their own dime just to bear witness. And seated at the front, calm and composed as ever, was Celeste Morgan. Lauren entered with her head lowered, her lawyer guiding her to the defense table. She looked thinner, smaller. Not because of guilt, because of loss. Not just of a job, but of the illusion that had once wrapped her tightly in a sense of entitlement. The judge read the charges: assault aboard a commercial flight, violation of FAA passenger rights, violation of federal anti-discrimination statutes. The courtroom fell silent as the prosecution began laying out the case with damning clarity video clips of the slap testimonies from Grace Holloway and Daniel Green, internal airline records showing prior complaints that had never been addressed. Then came the passenger logs. Celeste Morgan's name first on the list, marked in bold, annotated as confidential priority. When asked to speak, Celeste didn't rise with dramatics. She stood, slowly stepped forward, and faced the jury with the same unwavering calm she had carried since that day on the plane. "I am not here because I am the CEO of Right Skies Airlines," she began. "I am here because I was a woman traveling alone with a ticket that was questioned, a body that was disrespected, and a presence that was considered a threat only because it did not match someone's expectation of power." She paused. The courtroom held its breath. If I had been anyone else, if I didn't have the title I do, I would have walked off that flight in shame. Humiliated. Unheard. I'm not standing here for justice just for me. I'm standing for every passenger who doesn't have a CEO's name to shield them. One juror wiped his eye. Another sat taller in his seat. Lauren's defense tried to paint a different picture, that it was stress, miscommunication, a lapse in protocol. But each argument withered beneath the weight of recorded truth and collective memory. In the final testimony, Grace Holloway took the stand. Her voice shook for the first few words, but steadied as she went on. Lauren Briggs told me to stay quiet. She made me feel like doing the right thing was wrong. But Miss Morgan reminded me that silence in the face of injustice is also a choice, and I chose to stop being silent. The courtroom was still again. The verdict didn't take long. Guilty on all counts. The sentence, 12 months of probation with mandatory anti-discrimination training. A permanent ban from all FAA-licensed customer-facing aviation roles. 500 hours of community service in diversity and inclusion initiatives. It wasn't prison, but it was public, and it was permanent. After court adjourned, as people began to file out, a reporter asked Celeste, "Do you feel vindicated?" Celeste turned to her with a gaze as steady as ever. This was never about vindication. This was about validation for everyone who's ever been told to sit down when they should have stood. Outside the courthouse, it began to snow lightly. Celeste stepped out onto the sidewalk, her assistants flanking her. But she paused for a moment as a woman approached, middle-aged black in scrubs, clearly just off her nursing shift. "Miss Morgan," she said softly, "I've never been on one of your planes. I might never afford first class, but you made me feel like I still belong there." Celeste reached out and touched her arm gently. "You always have." The woman's smiled eyes shining. Later that evening on Right Sky's official website, a new section appeared under the banner, "Our Commitment." It wasn't written by marketing, it wasn't dressed up with legal phrasing, it simply read, "We see you, whether you're in seat 1A or 42E, whether you wear pearls or polyester, whether you fly weekly or once in a lifetime. This sky belongs to you too." And beneath it, reform doesn't begin with policy. It begins with people who refuse to stay silent. Celeste Morgan. That night, Grace received an email she hadn't expected, a formal invitation to join the newly created Dignity Leadership Council chaired by Celeste herself. Her hands trembled as she replied, "Yes. 1,000 times yes." Because she too now understood this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The months that followed felt different not because the world had suddenly changed, but because people had started to look at it with new eyes. In airports across the country, subtle but significant shifts unfolded. Gate agents smiled more sincerely, not because they were told to, but because they finally understood the weight of being the first face someone might see after years of being ignored. Baggage handlers, cleaning staff, call center workers, everyone seemed to carry themselves with a newfound quiet pride. At Right Skies Airlines, the transformation wasn't just visible, it was palpable. The Dignity Leadership Council, led by Celeste and staffed by individuals from every level of the company, including Grace Holloway, began reviewing historical passenger complaints, especially those dismissed for lack of evidence. For the first time, employees who had once felt voiceless were invited to speak. One janitor, 25 years with the airline, shared his experience of being constantly ignored in first class, sometimes even told not to interact too much. He now helped design a training module titled Presence Beyond Position. A transgender flight attendant shared how microaggressions used to pile up over each flight, never enough to report, but enough to chip away at dignity. Now she helped write the new employee manual chapter, Serving with Awareness. And Grace, she became a symbol not just of courage, but of transformation. Her quiet strength turned into mentorship. She led workshops not from slides, but from lived experience. If your gut tells you something's wrong, she would say, listen, and speak, even if your voice shakes. Outside the airline, Celeste's example continued to spark impact. Universities invited her to speak, but she rarely accepted. "I didn't do this for applause," she would say. "I did it because I was tired of watching people shrink to fit into places they already belonged." Instead, she funded scholarships for young women pursuing careers in aviation, especially those from underrepresented communities. One of the first recipients, a Somali-American engineering student, wrote, "Thank you for making space for wings I didn't think I was allowed to build." Celeste received awards, of course, some national, some international, but she rarely attended the ceremonies. She sent Grace in her place to one, Daniel Green to another. "Let the people who stood up with me share this," she said. "I didn't do it alone." And Lauren, after her sentencing, she disappeared from public view. But one day, Grace received a handwritten letter with no return address. The handwriting was shaky. the words uneven. Grace, I don't expect forgiveness, but I owe you thanks. You showed me what I didn't want to see about myself, and I'm sorry I didn't listen when it mattered most. You were brave, and I wasn't. L. Grace folded the letter and placed it inside the same notebook she had carried the day Celeste was slapped. On the first page beneath the Right Skies logo, she wrote a single sentence, "This is where I found my voice." Elsewhere at the newly renovated Right Skies headquarters, a portrait was unveiled. It showed two women, Celeste and Grace, standing side by side. No stage, no throne, just a hallway, just their eyes, one steady, one bright, below it etched in platinum, "Those with power choose, those with conscience challenge," and below that a plaque with no name, only a dedication. To every passenger who thought they had to stay quiet. To every employee who thought they had to look away. May you never doubt your right to be seen again. Celeste stood in front of it once alone before a leadership meeting. She didn't touch it. She didn't speak. She just closed her eyes and allowed herself one brief moment to feel the weight of everything that had been broken and everything that had begun to heal. Outside, another Right Skies plane cut through the clouds, and somewhere on board, someone reclined in seat 1A. Not with power, not with privilege, but with peace. Because finally, the sky was wide enough for all of us. A year after flight, WSS 472, the anniversary passed not with celebration, but with reverence. At airports across the nation, Right Skies terminals observed a quiet moment of reflection. No press releases, no commemorative hashtags, just a single line displayed on digital boards at every gate. One voice can land a new era, and across those gates, whether in Boston, LAX, or Dallas, passengers paused. Some didn't understand at first, others remembered immediately. A few whispered, "That was her flight." Inside a quiet conference room at the Right Skies Chicago HQ, Celeste Morgan stood in front of a modest crowd, not journalists or executives, but janitors, call center reps, and new recruits in crisp Navy uniforms. She didn't bring a speech, she brought a chair, she sat in it. This, she began gesturing toward the seat, is where it happened. Not at a podium, not in a corner office. Just in a chair. Being told I didn't belong. She stood, and this, she said, her voice steady, is how we rewrite that. Every person in the room knew what she meant. In the months since the trial, since the reform, since the ripples turned to currents, Right Skies had become a symbol not of perfection, but of possibility. A place where change didn't just get written in policy, it got worn in practice. Internally, the company launched Project Echo, a live rotating digital wall showcasing real-time employee and passenger stories submitted anonymously. Some were joyful, others painful, but all were seen. One read, "I used to whisper when I corrected passengers. Now I speak up. I learned that from Grace." Another said, "I'm a black father. My son and I flew last week. First class. For the first time, no one questioned it. They just smiled. That was enough." And on the anniversary morning, Grace Holloway, now the Director of Passenger Experience, stepped onto a new flight. WS 990, Chicago to San Diego. She walked through the cabin, not checking for uniform compliance, but checking for warmth, checking for truth. Her badge was polished. Her steps were light. But it was the way she looked at people seeing them that reminded the crew why they joined this profession to begin with. In seat 2C, a quiet older woman tugged gently at Grace's sleeve. "Excuse me, were you on that flight? The one everyone's still talking about?" Grace gave a soft smile. "Yes, ma'am, I was there." The woman nodded slowly. "Then thank you. You and her, you reminded me of something I thought I'd forgotten." "What's that?" Grace asked gently. The woman's eyes filled. "That kindness can still win." Meanwhile, across the country, Celeste sat alone in her favorite corner of a small coffee shop. No bodyguards, no assistants, no CEO entourage. Just her, a ceramic mug, and the sound of jazz over quiet speakers. She had just finished reading a letter from a young girl, only 11, who had watched the viral documentary about flight WS 472 with her mother. The girl wrote, "I want to be like you. Not because you're powerful, but because you didn't yell. You just told the truth and didn't move." Celeste folded the letter, placing it in a small envelope she kept for handwritten words. She looked out the window as another plane streaked through the sky above the city skyline. The clouds had returned, but this time they didn't feel heavy. They felt open, and inside those clouds flew countless people seen, respected, free. The next edition of Skies Above Right Skies in-flight magazine featured no celebrity interviews, no luxury vacation ads. Just one essay, page 1. It began a year ago. A woman refused to move from her seat. But what she really refused was to move from her worth. Because when you stop standing down, others start standing up. And beneath that, by Grace Holloway, passenger. Witness. Now leader. Passengers read it in silence. Some teared up. Others closed their eyes, breathing a little deeper. Because somehow from a flight that almost unraveled a world had begun to repair. And it reminded them all, you don't have to shout to be heard. You just have to stand and let the sky listen. 1 year and 1 day after the flight that changed everything, Celeste Morgan stood at Gate 12 of Hollow Creek Private Terminal, the very same airstrip where Flight WS-472 had made its emergency landing. This time she wasn't here as a passenger. She wasn't boarding. She wasn't inspecting. She was simply remembering. The wind carried the scent of jet fuel and fresh rain. The sunset painted long amber streaks across the tarmac. And in her hand was the same notebook she had carried that day, worn now, edges softened, filled with letters, quotes, scribbles and scars. Behind her, a few steps back, stood Grace Daniel Green and a few of the original passengers from that unforgettable flight. No stage, no microphones, just presence. Celeste opened the notebook one final time and spoke not to a camera, not to the press, but to the small gathering of hearts that had stood witness. I didn't plan to make a statement that day. I just wanted to be seen. Not as a CEO, not as a name on a list, just as someone who paid her fare and deserved a seat without judgment. She looked up, her eyes moving from Grace to Daniel to the silent witnesses. But when I stood up for that seat, what I really reclaimed was my story, and in doing so I realized that every seat holds a story, and every story deserves to be heard. She paused, voice steady. The slap wasn't the beginning. The silence before it was. And what changed the world after was not rage but the refusal to be erased. A tear slipped down Grace's cheek, but she didn't wipe it. She let it fall because it belonged. Celeste closed the notebook. Let this gate, this runway, this sky never again carry silence where a voice should have risen. The group stood still, holding that moment. And then, one by one, they began to clap. Not loudly, not theatrically, but with the kind of applause that blooms when people remember who they are and why it matters. That evening, as Celeste returned to her office for the last meeting of the day, she posted one final message on the Right Skies digital wall. You don't have to be a CEO to change something broken. You just have to refuse to stay silent when it cracks. Celeste Morgan. And with that, the story of Flight WS-472 closed its last chapter, not with a press headline or courtroom ruling, but with a legacy. A legacy etched into every seat where someone once felt invisible. A legacy carried by every crew member who now understands that service isn't about pouring drinks, it's about protecting dignity. A legacy ignited by one voice and lifted by many. So now, what about you? If you were Celeste, would you have stood your ground? Would you have spoken? Would you have believed your story mattered, even when someone else tried to erase it? Because maybe right now, you're sitting in your own version of Seat 1A. And if that's true, let this be your reminder. You don't have to yell to be heard. You don't need a title to be respected. You just have to say, no, I belong here. And the world will shift one seat at a time. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments. Send this to someone who needs to remember their worth. Like and follow us for more true stories of dignity, courage, and change. Because sometimes it only takes one moment to remind the world how it should have acted all along.